let's now move to the second area that we wanted to be able to look at. I think those are the most common methods that you find for corporate fundraising. And the other area is now to look at the subject of grant fundraising. So we come back to our usual way of getting funds, which is through grants. And so grant fundraising normally falls. The grant raising foundations that are there will normally be categorized in three categories. And so there are basically three categories that we can actually be able to consider. And one of the categories that we actually would need to be able to consider is what we are referring as operating foundations. And then secondly, we are also able to have what we call grant-making foundations, which is also one of the foundations also to be able to consider. And again, also you can also be able to have what we call a hybrid of either of the two foundations as well. So what are operating foundations? Operating foundations are basically those foundations that basically provide their own range of programs and are funded and managed by universities, hospitals, schools, orphanages, cultural institutions, and relief agencies, and many other non-profits. So in other words, these kind of foundations, they will not give you a grant and expect you that you should be able to operationalize that grant. Operating foundations basically have their own funds, and they also implement their own programs. So they normally don't have a situation where they actually use other people to implement some of the programs that they actually have. And so that's why they are actually referred as operating foundations. And so operating foundations normally will actually devote most of their resources to actively carry out their missions. A very good example is like this foundation that is known as Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art. Is basically an operating foundation. So Doris Duke Foundation will not actually be able to give you funds to go and implement projects. But what Doris Duke Foundation does is that it uses its own funding and basically does what it simply gets to find out some of the foundations that we actually need to be able to effectively look into. And so basically, it gets those foundations by itself as an organization. And so basically, it has the mission to improve the quality of people's lives through Islamic arts and culture, and that's why it's able to operate its own grants by itself. But now, these operating foundations will be very, very different from what we are referring to as grant-making foundation. And so we will have a difference here. We'll have a difference between the operating foundations and the grant-making foundations. So for grant-making foundations, by contrast, they do not engage in their own service provision directly. And these are some of the organizations that we actually approach for funds. And most of you know that you get funds from some of these organizations. And it is important to make sure that you are able to understand these grant-making foundations. So they further their mission by funding the work of other non-profits. And these are foundations that I know that a lot of organizations are able to look for funds. So grant-making foundations are only a 19th century phenomenon because such organizations first appeared in the United States, and then they were able to spread throughout Western Europe, spread throughout Japan, India, and Latin America. And so that's how those organizations were able to come through. And they actually, they can be supported by a private source of income, or they can be supported by the public as expected. So, so they are actually supported by private sources of income, and also can be supported by public sources of income. And again, also, therefore, they can be private grant-making foundations, or they can be what we call public grant-making foundations or public charities. So again, also, you can find that classification under grant-making foundation. So, so certain grant-making foundations are private grant-making foundations, and others are public grant-making foundations. So when they are public, then we know these are basically run by the local government or local government agencies. And so that is why they're able to be considered as public grant-making foundations as expected. So it's good to make sure that we are able to understand that as much as possible. Now, how is the distribution of grant fundraising? So we basically just try to use that graphic that basically shows where a lot of funds come from. And so what we able to look at, we first saw that we have what we call operating foundations. And as you can see there, about $8.1 million basically come from operating foundations. Then the biggest chunk of it basically comes from grant-making foundations, that is either independent foundations or community foundations, and they actually constitute the other 85%, with 74% going to independent foundations, and also community foundations actually contributing 11%. So, so it's important to make sure that you are able to have a look at that as much as possible. And it is important to make sure that we are able to see that kind of distribution, so that we know which organizations we should actually be able to go for funds anytime we are doing grants fundraising. So now let's just turn our attention to what we are referring to as the grant fundraising process. Of course, for you to be able to consider grants, there's always a typical process through which you are able to go through as much as possible. So it's always good to be able to consider this whole process of grant fundraising process as expected. So, so normally one of the things that we always advise everybody in grant fundraising process is to start with research. So it's always good to make sure you sit down and research companies that actually provide funds. So you're able to do what we call foundation research. And after that, you are also able to consider assessment and prioritization. And again, after that, you are also able to consider initial contact. That also really becomes important to be able to consider. And then again, also, you are also able to consider application and proposal, which also becomes quite critical to be able to consider. And then also the whole issue of relationship building also becomes another critical process to be able to do. The only thing is that I know that a lot of organizations don't consider research, that is looking for foundations that can actually fund you. So it's always good to make sure that our organizations take research seriously, so that you can be able to know what organizations are giving funds there as much as possible. I know this is common practice for bigger organizations like UNHCR Let's just be able to go into each of these steps and see what exactly happens in each of these steps. So, so when you say the first process of grant making fundraising is foundation research. So what exactly do we mean when you talk about foundation research? So there are a variety of sources that fundraisers can actually draw on to identify potential grant funders. So we have different sources that we can always be able to consider. And the Foundation Center Directory will be able to be one of the directories that is very, very helpful, where we are able to see data on potential funders. So it's important to make sure that we are actually able to consider the whole issue of the foundation center directory. And it is important to make sure that we actually are able to consider that. So foundation center directory will be able to have information on variety on some of the variety of organizations that are available. And so, so the Foundation Center is normally an American non-profit organization that is normally headquartered in New York City. And the center's stated mission is to strengthen the social sector by advancing knowledge about philanthropy in the US and around the world. And so normally it has information about these different foundations and basically their address, their phone numbers, and their websites. Also, that directory also shows the donors that support those foundations. And again, also, they are also able to give the background of the foundation, including the history of that particular foundation as expected. Then the other thing is also the funding limitations that are there, basically outlining explicitly any areas that the foundation will actually not be able to fund. And so it is actually able to outline areas that the foundation does not focus on. And then it also is able to provide information on the purpose, the activities, including the mission statement that is available, and also what are some of the program areas and what are some of the funding programs that we actually have. So those are some of the things that we actually need to be able to consider. That is on foundation research, and I would encourage you to go and check some of this information available at the Foundation Center Directory. And secondly, now, once you do your research, is the issue of assessment and prioritization. So having identified a list of potential funders through your research, then it is therefore necessary to prioritize this list of potential funders with those organizations that actually appear best prospects for you to be able to succeed in this particular area. So it's always good to identify the list of potential. And typically, initial lists of potential funders can be quite lengthy, and because fundraising resources are always limited, it is always important to ensure that we are able to prioritize the efforts as expected. And so to be able to achieve this, fundraisers will actually need to be able to examine the fit between their own objectives and projects, and also the mission objects of the target organization as expected. And efforts should always be focused on those organizations that will actually appear to have the highest degree of fit as expected. Now, again, also, we will also be able to also be important to ensure that we assess the match in terms of the size of the likely grants that might actually be awarded, and also the timelines within which decisions will actually be reached as expected. So it's always good to also be able to consider that as well. Now, thirdly, the other aspect that we actually need to be able to consider is the issue of the initial contact. And certain foundations will normally permit a limited degree of contact before a submission is actually made. So certain foundations will basically permit a limited degree of contact before a submission is actually made. And when this is possible, it is actually advisable to make sure that we are able to explore this before sending in an initial expression of interest. And so it's important to make sure that we are able to undertake this. And then personal contact should ideally happen at or above the level of program officer, who will be directly responsible for reviewing the application as expected. And initial contacts may actually be able to take the form of a phone call or an email, or even a face-to-face meeting as expected. So some of the initial contacts will actually take those kind of forms. And the first goal of these initial contacts is to always give the representative of the funder your best case for support in brief, and also to be able to get your feedback on how to be able to improve the presentation of the case based on the foundation's strategic grant making plans or their evaluation criteria as expected. And any tips that may actually be offered about the organization current interest or concerns can also be very, can also prove invaluable in drafting the application that will actually be able to follow. So it's always good to be able to consider that as much as possible. Then the next stage that you're able to head to is a stage of application and the proposal. Remember, when it comes to grant making process, grant fundraising process, one of the things that we will normally apply for grants for is either through application or through proposal. So we can apply for grants through an application form, or we can apply for grants through a proposal. So either of those should actually be one of the best channels to be able to make an application or a proposal. And applications to foundations will normally take a variety of different forms, and some of the foundations actually require applicants to complete detailed application forms, while others allow nonprofits to be able to develop their own free-form proposals. So it always depends on the foundation that is funding you. It can actually want you to complete a detailed application form, while another will basically allow nonprofits to be able to develop their own free-form proposals. So the proposal should always be developed according to the proposal guidelines that are actually provided by the foundation. So in this case of the free form submission, the length and the style of the proposal should always be developed according to the proposal guidelines that are provided by the foundation. So it's always good to make sure you are aware of the expectations that are expected even as you put your application or your proposal together. Then after this, what you do is you basically head to building relationship. That's the other critical process as well. Once you have been able to apply, once you have been able to make a proposal and you're successful, the most important thing is also to make sure you build a relationship. So once the grant has actually been obtained, it's always good to draft a letter of thanks that should actually be dispatched immediately, and any requirements for reporting, for recognition, for anonymity or feedback should actually always be clarified. As this should actually be diarized and also adhered to strictly as much as possible. And whereas there is no specific guidance issued, reports on the progress should be submitted every 6 months as expected. So it's always good to make sure that the form that this reporting should take should also be noted as much as possible. And for most foundations, they may want both project and financial reports. And in the case of the former, they may want to track very specific types of outcomes as much as possible. And so the necessary components of any report should be accumulated as the project progresses. Critical reasons, critical processes for fundraising process as expected. Now, a lot of people ask, but I apply for grant funding, or actually I send proposals for grant funding, and how comes I'm never funded successfully? So a lot of people ask those kind of questions and wonder, why do we not always turn out to be successful whenever we do grant applications or grant fundraising as much as possible? Now, one of the things that is important to be able to note is that you can see from the statistics, about 55% of applications do not actually read the requirements. So a lot of people fail because they missed on requirements of the funding, and that is a critical thing that actually needs to be considered. And so they are not able to read requirements, and that actually becomes one of the critical considerations. Again, also, sometimes you also find that a lot of applications send large amounts of unnecessary information. So that's another thing that actually leads to some of these proposals to be declined. Some applications are poorly represented. Some applicants do not state how the funds will actually be used. Some applicants did not read instructions before making the application. Some applicants did not include their accounts when requested. Some applicants did not clear their tax status. Some application was impersonal and mass-produced. And this is a big issue, especially for most organizations, where people develop ready-made proposal templates, and they don't respond to the requirements. They just send their general template. And this can be a good reason to fail. So no reply envelope was included where requested. An applicant was over-friendly in either postal or telephone communications. Applicants sent insufficient information for a decision to be made. Applicant did not state the amount of funding that they were actually pushing, they were actually seeking. And the application was too much of a splash. Also becomes another issue where grant applications are actually declined. Now let's just, that's much to do with the grant fundraising process. It's also good that we're able to look at the issue of fundraising events as much as possible.